Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our meeting of December 2nd, the meeting of the Ad Hoc Ethics Code Review Committee on December 2nd, 2021. Forgive me for going into the last century. And is there a motion to open the meeting?
I make a
Make
motion
that
to
motion.
open the meeting.
Second,
Second.
all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
The meeting is now in session. Thank you for joining. And I indicated that I would, in a couple of prior emails to you, I indicated that we would try to make this meeting as efficient as possible for all concerned, and also to help Nora get to her next meeting. So I circulated earlier today I hesitate to call it a script, call it more an aid memoir to enable us to get through the meeting quickly. So first item of business is the approval of the minutes of the meeting of June 29th, 2021. I believe I sent a copy to you of the minutes as annotated by me and perhaps by others. Is there a motion to approve those minutes as amended and annotated?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion? In the absence of discussion, all in favor, please indicate aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion is carried. Let us now go to the sections of the amended Code of Ethics. Or I should say the draft Code of Ethics. And I'm going to plunge right into the various sections that we changed, or we proposed to change, following the discussion we had with the sitting ethics board and the recommendations that they made. So the first item of business, or the first item, is sections 21-17B, which is a suggestion by the ethics board that the advisory opinions and requests for advisory opinions shall be indexed and maintained on file. We had the ethics board. They are recommending that we substitute the village clerk. Is there a motion to accept the recommendation on advisory opinions as set forth by my email of November 29th?
You're saying substituting village clerk for ethics board?
Yes, to maintain advisory opinions and requests for advisory opinions shall be indexed and maintained on file, and their recommendation is to substitute village clerk.
And do we remember whether I don't think we had an extensive dialogue. We just thought we didn't discuss clerk and have a reason village clerk for not doing it. I just don't recall.
I'm in favor of the recommended change. My reason for being in favor of it is I feel that the ethics board will have turnover, and if you don't have somebody who is essentially an officer of the village, not that the ethics board's members are not, but just I think the village clerk is the person that should be collating and keeping that data.
All right.
I agree.
I make a motion to change it to village clerk.
I second the motion.
Any discussion on the motion?
No.
If not, all in favor, please signify by aye or raising hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion is carried. Next, section 21-5K, which is actually, I had it in my email to you as 21-2. It's 21-5K. And the this is a recommendation by Brian that we clarify this section, section 2, so that the no covered person within 2 years after termination of service within the village, shall appear as part of his or her employment before any agency, board, commission, committee, council, etc., or engage in any official village business transaction or professional activity, unless such appearance or engagement is previously approved by the Board of Trustees.
I think that's perfectly appropriate, and that's a good recommendation by Brian.
I agree.
Is there a motion to amend the draft as proposed?
I make that motion.
I
Second.
second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? That motion is carried, and we thank you, Brian. Section 21-2, concerning the applicability of the Code of Ethics, and I described to you in my email what the ethics, some members of the ethics board suggested that the applicability section was too broad. And I believe that the section as drafted should be retained, and it is not overbroad.
And I think during the conversation with the ethics board, they came around to that way of thinking as well.
I think so.
Kind of, yeah.
Is there a motion to retain the section as drafted by the committee?
I make a motion to retain it.
Second,
I'll second.
is there any discussion on this motion? If not, please, all in favor indicate aye.
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 Any opposed? That is carried. The definition section on confidential information, there was some thought that this section was overbroad. And my view was that, and I think we were persuasive in that the scope of the section was important. And I pointed out that I actually adapted it from existing law. Is there a motion to retain the section as drafted by the committee?
Before we go on, I mean, my concern is.
Can we put it on the table there?
Sure,
John?
yes.
Is there a motion to retain the section? I move to retain the section. Is there a second?
I'll second it so that we can have a discussion.
All right, it's on the table. So go ahead, John.
My concern is, I think we are losing sight of what constitutes confidential information. It's overly broad, and in my opinion, it's overly broad. And it seems to me that in the end, we can redact confidential information only when a determination has not been made by the ethics board. We cannot redact confidential information once a determination has been made. This is my opinion, the way I understand this. Once the ethics board has voted on an issue, that vote becomes a public vote. And the issue and all of the documentation that goes along with it becomes public. So,
John, I'm not sure if all the information that goes along with it is public. I think some of it can be redacted, but that's probably more of a question for our village attorney.
right.
To your concerns, and I'm not trying to ram something through, but just in general, these are our recommended changes, which are gonna have to be approved by the village attorney.
No,
the
I know
Board of
that.
Trustees.
Yeah,
So
right.
I think stuff like that will be caught. I would hope it would be caught and the verbiage cleaned up appropriately.
I would agree, but I don't want there to be I don't want there to be a misunderstanding about it. My feeling and my experience, having been a Board of Trustees member is once you have voted on an issue, regardless of whether or not it was in an executive session or not, the vote becomes public, and the material that you relied on for that vote also becomes public. So,
John, I confess to being a little, if not confused, I'm not quite sure what part of this section you believe is in conflict with what may or may not become public.
I think we're misrepresenting what confidential information could and cannot be. Once a vote happens by the board of, the ethics board, that they don't have a choice in what is confidential and what is not confidential.
But I believe this section specifically addresses information. I believe it carves out a very clear definition of what confidential information is. I don't think it interferes with the workings of the ethics board. The intent, say my intent, and I think the intent of drafters, is to assure, for example, that a content of information at executive session or an RFP, not an RFP, but a response to an RFP, that it's clear that that's not public information. And it's a warning, it's a caution to anyone who comes into possession of that in the course of their duties.
Right. But if I understand what you're saying, and I agree, but to a certain level, if the ethics board makes a determination that there has been a violation, at that point, and they have a vote on whether or not a violation has occurred, be that whatever violation it may be, that vote becomes public. And it is not redactable.
Oh, are you saying that if they bring a complaint against somebody who they accuse of publicizing confidential information, that proceeding becomes public?
No, I'm saying if a person, if the ethics board, if somebody brings a charge, somebody makes a claim against an employee or a board member, and it's not substantiated, that would be, my understanding is that would be deemed confidential information. And, in order to avoid sullying somebody's reputation, that would not be releasable information. On the other hand, if the ethics board determined that it was a substantiated charge, and they filed made a claim against that employee or board member, at that point it becomes a public document. I think that's what the disjointedness is, and I don't want people to be unaware of that when we're having
John,
this discussion.
I have a question for you, and I'm not challenging you, it's really a question. You said that once that determination is made, it's public information and not redactable. Is that really the case? Because I thought it would still be redactable.
Only if it's determined by the village attorney that the release of the publicly identifiable information would be damaging to someone.
Right. So if that's the case, then I'm not sure what the issue is with this. Because it is then redactable if need be.
it's the things that you can redact are very clearly defined. You know,
All
they're
right,
not,
just-
they're
I'm
not,
not aware, so,
yeah, I mean, they're not, they're not typically, if somebody is in fact found in violation of the ethics code of the Village of Mamaroneck, that would be, I don't know that that would be redactable.
I have a suggestion, two suggestions. One, John, if you could write a set forth in writing what your concern is about this. I will make this part of our final report so that we have flagged it
Okay.
for the village council.
And in the end, that's really all, I believe we should be doing anyway. I mean, it's up to them to make their determination.
Yeah. So with
Yep.
with that in mind, I'm going to ask for a vote on whether, is there any more discussion on this? If not, I'm going to ask for a vote on whether the motion, if there is a vote on retaining, all in favor of retaining the section as drafted by the committee, please indicate by raising your hand or saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Me.
Okay, I will note that accordingly.
Okay.
I just
Thank
gotta
you.
say, it's the first non-unanimous vote we've ever had. So congratulations.
I'm not so sure about that. I think earlier in our, I think we've had some, I think we've had some divided votes before, but I'm not entirely sure.
I'm not sure they were official votes. I know we've had discussions where
Yeah.
we
No.
disagreed.
I think Mike and I agreed, but for different reasons
Okay.
on issues that you guys disagreed with, we disagreed with you on.
Okay. Now we go to section 25 D. And bear with me a second there. This is, oh, this was a corrective recommendation
But-
to add the word covered to 25D. No covered person shall directly or indirectly solicit any gift, contribution, or donation from any person or business entity on village property.
Right, that was just a typo of.
Yeah,
omission. Yep.
but going to that, I'm not so, I mean, I don't know why we would put covered or not covered. Nobody should be soliciting on village property. Covered or uncovered.
That's not a question for the code of ethics. I mean, we can't control non-covered people.
Exactly. So it's not a total population thing, John.
I just would say no covered, no person shall indirectly or I would add solicit or accept.
Right, but John, the code of ethics is referring to the covered people.
Right.
And we just left out the word covered. That was a typo. Every place else we say no covered person or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. I'm fine if you want to go with no covered person. I would just say directly or indirect. I mean, it's minor, but if we're trying to get at the same problem from the other side, which is a non-covered person doing all of this, then we should say on the flip side, No covered person shall directly or indirectly solicit any gift or contribution or donation, nor accept any gift, contribution, or
Solicit or accept. I think that's right.
and I'm not trying to get at, you know, employees getting holiday gifts or anything like that. I mean, I mean, that's, I'm talking about major contracts.
Is there a motion to change the section to add the word covered and to add the phrase solicit or accept?
I make
You know
a
what?
motion.
Can I make an amendment? I mean,
Yeah, go.
I don't want this to be seen as a way, you know, I know we're at holiday time. I give minor, small tokens of my appreciation to some municipal employees. And I just, you know, I think we should just leave it as is, and the covered part is fine.
So not add or
Yeah.
accept.
Yeah. You know, I'm probably reading too deep into things.
I'm wondering if that was the original intent for not having accepted. Let's leave it as it is.
I would agree.
I have to
Alright.
go to the other meeting, but Dan is host, so when my leaving should not affect this. If it does, someone call me and we'll go to Plan B.
Thank you, Nora.
Okay, thanks, Nora.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
For all you've
Bye.
done.
Okay, so is there a motion to change this section to add the word covered? Leave it
I
at that.
make a motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
Any discussion, further discussion? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that is covered. The next is the definition of relative.
Oh,
And as I indicated, there was concern expressed that the definition section would, that someone said it should account for relationships that were friendships or sexual relationships. And we responded and said that we didn't think this was legally definable or statutory, and was more the province of an HR policy. So I think we should support the section as drafted. Let's get it on the table first. Is there a motion to retain the section as drafted by the committee?
I make the motion.
Is there a second? I
I
second.
second.
Is there any discussion on this section definition?
I would only like to, there's really no discussion, but Jocelyn and John, you were not on the call with the Board of Ethics or the Ethics Board. They did raise this, and as we were talking, it was like, where do you draw the line?
Right.
You know,
I
what's,
think I was on at the tail end of that meeting.
yeah. And it would just become like this enormous population. So there's no way to really control that going to that extent.
Right. I think there has to be a level of immediacy
Yep.
that
Yeah.
I hesitate to think what an investigation of that would entail.
Oh, my God. What?
Any further discussion on that one?
No.
All in favor of retaining the section as drafted?
Aye.
I,
Any opposed?
I am.
It is, the motion is carried. 20.
wait, did somebody say I'm opposed?
John.
I think it was Brian.
Oh,
Oh,
Brian.
oh, Brian, you're opposed?
Yeah, I just think it should include like even if it's a secret, if someone's having an affair, like I still think that should be legislatable. I just don't know how to legislate it because I don't know how to word it. I don't think it should be included as a relative. I just think like if you're having sex with someone and you don't want, like if you're having an affair and you're like acting on a matter, like say you're a zoning board member and you have a sexual relationship with like an applicant and you don't want anyone to know just because it's like you're having an affair with someone against your husband or wife or whatever the situation is. I think that should be not allowed. I don't think that should be allowed.
Well, I think it might come under one of the other prohibitions about having an interest. So I don't think the
Yeah, doesn't that come under some of the recusal stuff?
I believe it does. So I think, Brian, if to define what a friendship or a sexual relationship is would be extremely difficult. And
Yeah.
reminds me of when Bill Clinton was confronted with his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and everyone was twisting themselves into knots trying to figure out whether he lied or not. But I will duly record your no vote.
Or I am too. So I had a question. So I have a question. If it's in the recusal, so what do you say if you recuse yourself? You don't obviously, oh, I'm having an affair, I'm having sex with that person.
No, but
you
you would
say-
say you had a personal interest. And if it's found out later on that you're messing around with that person, that's a personal interest, you know, it comes out.
But also by the very same token, you don't need to disclose at the meeting what your conflict is. You just need to say, I have a conflict.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, can we move on to 21.6F, where 21.6, where the members of the ethics board requested that the list of persons required to file annual disclosure statements also be filed with the village clerk treasurer in addition to the ethics board. Is there a motion? We want to get it on the table. Is there a motion to make that change in the draft code?
I make
I
that
make-
motion.
Is there
I'll
a second?
second it.
Any discussion on that? If there was no discussion, all in favor signify by saying aye.
I,
Aye. Opposed? That's adopted. The next section has to do with a request by the ethics board that the fines be that the fines which were heretofore set forth in exact dollars be scalable by them so they have more flexibility. Let's get it on the table first. Is there a motion to adopt the language making the specified fines scalable?
I make the motion.
Any second? I second. Any discussion on that?
No.
I think it's a good idea. If there is no discussion, all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
I
I,
Any opposed? That motion is carried. Thank you. Next is the 21-7. The members of the ethics board said that insofar as the way we drafted it, in the event that the village clerk treasurer or the ethics board determines that a disclosure statement misstates or omits material information, the ethics board informs the covered person who filed the disclosure statement of the misstated information. The members said that the clerk treasurer should not be a determiner of misstated information. And they also said that a filer should have more than 10 days to file an objection, and that the objection should be filed also with the clerk treasurer, and the ethics board should have 30 days to reply with its decision. Is there a motion to adopt their suggestion, and then we can get it on the table?
I make the motion.
I second it. What are your thoughts on this? And there's a couple.
The only thing I would like to add, I think it's valid that the clerk treasurer would not be able to validate all the information, but I think our intent, and maybe I'm wrong, our intent was to make sure like name, rank, serial number was filled out properly before it went forward.
Yeah,
It wasn't necessarily the meaty content. So I don't know how,
substantive.
yeah, I don't know how we clean up the wording for that. But, you know, I agree with what they were recommending, but our intent was for the clerk treasurer to have that first cut. You know, you have a typo in your address or, you know, whatever it is.
Well, that would, remember, it says misstates material information.
Okay, so fine. As long as materials highlighted. Yep.
My only feeling is you don't misstate material information. You have inaccurate material information. And, you know, that's just my take. You know, a misstate is, you know, I said I was living in New Jersey when I'm living in, you know, New York during that period. Inaccurate is, you know, I own 50% of the company that's in contract with the village.
Well, I suppose the alternative word would be submits false information.
I don't think it has to be intentionally false. It's just, I mean, it's just for whatever reason, it's inaccurate. It's inaccurate. It's deemed to be inaccurate.
The term is that a disclosure statement contains inaccurate information or omits information. Do you like inaccurate better than misstate?
Yeah, I mean, misstate is soft. Inaccurate is, it doesn't matter what the reason that it's inaccurate. It is, you know, I don't know. I don't think it really makes a difference at the end of the day, but my real objection to this whole paragraph is I don't like the fact that somebody has the ability to misstate something, then the ethics board is in a position to, you know, make their notice of objection, and all while presumably, let's just say somebody from a land use board is the person in question. This all, you know, does this person get pulled away from their land use board responsibilities while this gets resolved?
I mean, for a period of 30 days?
I don't know. I mean, at what point? That's what and I could see how people, you know, applicants who maybe feel like they're not going to get a fair shake from somebody, or they feel like they're not going to get a fair shake from somebody, would go to the ethics board about something, you know, so then you start going down a rabbit hole. But
So John, what do you
I think
recommend?
we have a tough time allowing somebody who misstates information on their, you know, disclosure allowing them to vote on issues on whatever board they're on. I think that's a very slippery slope for us. You know, if we know that they have misrepresented information, whether intentional or unintentional, allowing them to sit on a board and continue to participate is kind of
Right, but I think all this is getting to is who identifies it. The ethics board or the clerk treasurer.
yes, but later on in the paragraph, it says something about suspension from office and, you know, during the pendency of the notice of objection. And so my concern is, you know, are we going to suspend anybody that is, you know, that has been, has a, if somebody brings forward an issue to the village clerk or the ethics board of a disclosure statement issue, are we going to suspend everybody or just some people, or is it going to be, frankly, it really is the Village of Mamaroneck's Board of Trustees that has to make that determination? I think this is
I think
a,
that's valid, but that's a different issue than.
no, that's what I mean. So there are multiple issues here for me. The one is misstates. I think that's soft. The other is, you know, whether or not somebody is removed from their position of authority, whether it's on a board, land use board, or as a, you know, somebody that can commit village funds in any way. And while this issue gets resolved. And then the second part of that is, if that's what we're going to say, then we're going to have people using the ethics board as a cudgel to get back at people.
Or can you just state the timeline again? Between like they have 15 days and the Board of Ethics has 20 days or something?
Currently, the ethics board informs a covered person of we'll call it an inaccuracy or an omission. The covered person can amend the disclosure statement without penalty within 10 days of receipt of notification, or within 10 days, file a notice of objection. Upon receiving the notice of objection, the ethics board has 10 days to inform the covered person. The ethics board is saying, we would like 30 days to respond. And the covered person has 15 days to file the notice of objection, and we have 30 to respond.
I think that's so unfair. I really think so. Like, why can't we make it equal for each? Like the person saying like, oh, you have this misstated information, the Board of Ethics, why can't it be equal? Why can't it be like 20 days for each? Like, that's not fair at all.
Well, in now that
Like,
I'm
obviously, like one person can do it quicker than a board of 5. Like, they can just amend their information quicker. I still think they should have equal time, if you know what I mean.
I'm looking at it, and now I'm wondering if we only provide for suspension upon failing to file the disclosure statement. I'm not sure. I'm looking at it now and wondering whether we've written in a right to suspend the covered person for reason of an omission or inaccuracy. And I don't know that we did. So that may not even be applicable.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either.
I'm looking at the section we wrote about suspension, because I put in a search for the word suspension, and I'm finding the only mention of it is.
It says under I mean, it only says the ethics board may grant postponement of the suspension from office during the pendency. So I think they can suspend while this whole like battle's going on.
But I think that.
But first of all, the ethics board doesn't have the authority to to suspend somebody from office.
Covered Yeah, it's operation, it looks like it's operational law. If a covered
And-
person fails to file a disclosure statement on the date due for filing, their membership is suspended. I think you're right, John. I think that there's a disconnect there. So the only grounds I think for suspension are failing to file. Let me clean that up.
Okay.
Let me clean that up. And assuming, and I'm assuming now that they can't suspend for this. And
I'm
If-
I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't. I am just raising the issue
yeah,
that,
I don't know that I don't know that we gave them that authority.
right,
And probably they shouldn't be just on the basis of an allegation.
right.
What about, let me clean that up. And what I'm saying is that if we didn't give them the authority to suspend, then I'm not going to put it in there. And we'll leave suspension for the failure to file. And we'll change misstate to inaccurate. And we'll accept the recommendation of 15 days and 30 days. How does that all sound to you guys?
I don't agree.
What do you, how do you,
I just think it should be equal. Like, I don't think that's fair at all. Like, you're saying, oh, this person had to object within 10 days, but the ethics board, oh, the special, they have 30 days. Like, that's
well,
ridiculous.
no, we would expand the 10 to 15, Brian,
Be the
but
same.
because the ethics board has multiple members and they've got to get together, this debate, decide and write, we give them 30.
Then I think the person should have 30. I'm sorry.
So Brian, while I agree, I understand your point. What I get concerned about is you now have an issue where somebody has an open ethics issue for 2 months.
Then why can't the ethics board meet quicker?
As I mentioned,
Why don't each party have 20 days? It adds up to 40 days, just like what we have now with the 15.
Yeah,
I think in
but-
30 days, that's actually quicker.
But Brian, I think what it gets to, which Dan mentioned earlier, the ethics board needs to coordinate amongst many people if they need to schedule a special meeting versus one person you're an individual, you can control when you respond.
I agree.
And I think that's the difference in the timing.
Sorry.
And what we really don't want to do is set up a situation where the ethics board by default, waves their hand at something and says there's no problem here because we're making it hard for them to meet.
I don't know. Especially
I'm-
with this whole Zoom thing, it's so much easier to meet. I'm sorry.
No,
Well-
well, I don't know how much longer Zoom is
Yeah,
gonna
this
be.
will be, it's gotta stand the test of time, at least
Yeah.
till the next group takes a look.
Sorry,
Even if it's not a Zoom thing, it's still, the ethics board is a group of volunteers. I don't know all the individuals, but I'm assuming some of them work for a living, which means they're not always available.
But I think Brian's point is they should be equal, correct? So I guess the question is can we make them both the same?
No, I understand,
Yeah.
but I'm not, I guess I'm disagreeing with the necessity of that, but at the end of the day, I don't really care.
I think we should agree to their request because this is one where I think we should go along with them. on the number of days because they are the sitting ethics board. They're the ones, they specifically asked for this. They're the ones who have the experience deliberating these issues. And I think this is important for purposes, we're regulating a body that we don't sit on. And here's the body saying to us, these are the times we think these are the time periods we think are fair.
Or I had a question, sorry, like what if you're like a Michael Bloomberg or someone who has interest in like all these different things and you have to do research? Like the ethics board has like 20 days or 30 days to literally get 5 people together, but someone has to like research like their whole like not life story, but their whole like business interest. Like it's a lot sometimes for a person. I just think it should be equal. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just don't think that's fair.
All
Like,
right.
like a prosecutor and a defendant, they shouldn't have unequal adjournment times. Like it should be equal. I just don't see why this is different. Like if like a prosecutor got a postponement, a defendant should get a postponement. Like it should be equal.
Well, in fact, the prosecution has a higher burden in terms of when they can charge and go to trial. So,
Well, then here I think we're favoring the prosecutor in this situation. I really think I think they should be equal.
okay. I'm going to ask for a vote on this then. So, let's start with changing the term misstate to use the term inaccurate. All in favor of that signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed on that? Let's now go to the question of whether should we approve the ethics board's request to expand the period of time to file the objection to 15 days and expand the period of time to respond to 30 days. All in favor of that, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
I'm opposed.
I will vote aye as well, but I do appreciate Brian's point very much.
Okay, I'll write a dissenting opinion. I'm gonna become like Clarence Thomas now.
Oh, all right, so Clarence, as much as I voted aye, I'm really neutral.
Okay.
All right. This
I
is a
could
good,
go
I just
either
read a
way.
book about him. That's why I mentioned him.
this is a discussion, a good discussion, and I think what I will do is note that this was in our final report. I will note that this was a request of the ethics board, and that we had a divided committee on it. I mean,
That
again,
sounds good.
we are not legislating. We are making recommendations, and the minority needs to be represented in our recommendations. And so you will.
And sorry, can I just also make one more point on this?
Yes.
Because I think the person being like, I don't want to say accused, like the subject person, they can have a choice of either amending their information or objecting. So they should have time to decide that, like how they're going to proceed. Like they should just have more time, in my opinion. And certain,
Okay.
but yeah, it should be.
Justice Clarence, I think you just lost me on that one. I think because they have, I think because they have the option of either A or B, they can choose the better one for themselves. So they should be able to make that decision probably faster, but
I don't think so. Sorry.
Brian, we're splitting hairs on something that hopefully never really gets addressed.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's go to 2117 advisory opinions. The members of the ethics board expressed the view that the village assure that advisory opinions be stored securely for continuity purposes, and I suggested that we add the section, the village clerk shall maintain on the village website a publicly available file of advisory opinions. Is there a motion to add that to the draft code?
I make
I
that
make a
motion.
motion.
Is there a second?
I second. I'm not sure if John or I made the motion.
That's fine. Is there any discussion on on that motion? In the absence of a discussion, all in favor signify by saying aye.
I
Aye.
Any opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Now we go to 19D, where Ellen made a suggestion that we, I think this was an omission on my part, that the training program and materials for education and training be reviewed with the ethics board and the village attorney prior to the administration of such training. And I know, Brian, you had some commentary on this, and to which I responded. So first, let's get it on the table. Is there a motion to amend the section of the draft code along the lines as I indicated in my email to you?
I make the motion.
Second.
I second.
Thank you. Discussion on this motion? If
Can
there-
I? All right,
Yes,
so
go.
there were a bunch of emails going back and forth. Dan, you and I had a conversation. Brian, you and I had a conversation. All off the record, so I apologize for that. When you get hung up on training stuff, and I did a whole lot of training in my career, it's a very fine line, and Jocelyn in HR, you'd probably agree with this, between, I hope you would, between process versus what the code should be. So when Nora chimed in one of the emails recommending that we hire someone to do this training, to me, that's process. When we look at creating the documents and what's being used as training materials, that's process. So if we're saying that the village manager / the HR person is responsible for defining or developing the training program as well as administration, part of that training program development includes, do we hire an outside person to look at our code and develop the right training materials? To me, that's part of the process, not what the code should be. So I just wanted to try to differentiate where we were, or where I thought we were.
Any other comments on that? If not, all in favor of amending the section of the draft code as indicated, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. And thank you, Ellen, for that clarification. Now, we'll move to the section of the discussion on the final report and delivering the final report to the Board of Trustees. I'm acutely mindful of the fact that we go out of business at the end of this month,
That's,
and that there did not seem to me to be a great appetite to have more meetings. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about that.
I second that motion.
I thought that
But
perhaps
I'm in favor of a celebratory party, but keep going.
that we'll have, and we don't need the Board of Trustees to authorize us for that.
Correct.
And I promise you, when COVID is over, I would love to have you guys all over here, and we can get together and over drinks and some food. But what I propose is that I will combine the two interim reports into one report, add what we've discussed tonight, make duly note the dissenting views, emphasizing that we are not handing them a finished code and saying, here's your code from Mount Sinai. We are making recommendations. And what I would propose to do is put this in final, send it to you all, invite your comments. I'm sure you'll have comments. I'll make whatever adjustments need to be made. I'll send it back to you. And then in the absence of further comment, that will be our final report. I'll send it to the Board of Trustees, or if a single member of our committee says, no, I want a meeting because I think there are issues we need to discuss, or Dan, you wrote something in the report which needs to be changed, we will convene a meeting. And it is my hope to get you this final report sometime next week. So you will have ample time to read it. And if there are comments, I will respond quickly on the comments. If there is a demand or request for a meeting, we'll convene a meeting. So what I'm asking for.
Are you done? No.
That-
No, he's not. Sorry, it's so funny.
So what I'm asking for is a motion to appoint the chair of the committee to draft the final report, to include the 2 prior interim reports, add the additional content to the code agreed upon at this meeting, noting minority comments, distribute the final report to the committee for comments, respond to comments and make changes as required, redistribute the final report to the committee. In the absence of further comment, transmit a final report to the Board of Trustees, or upon the request of one committee member, convene a meeting of the committee for further discussion. So I'll ask for a motion just to get that on the table.
Make that motion.
Is there a
I
second?
I second.
Okay, discussion on this motion.
I think that's a great approach. It gives us the opportunity to say yay or nay, and if it's a nay, we meet again.
And anyone else?
Yeah, I agree. Sorry about laughing earlier. It was just really funny.
That's because Jocelyn wants us to be done.
And all right, is there any other, all right, if there's no other discussion, all in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
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 I
Opposed? The motion is carried. I will take out my quill pen and get to work. Is there any additional business to discuss?
I mean, then I did have one question about the minutes for this meeting. How do they get approved if we don't meet again?
I will
I think
include. Go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say, I think we can approve them via email.
All right, that's fine with me.
Yeah. And I can include that in the, and in fact, I'll amend my motion to accept, well, I'm just gonna leave it alone for now. Let's just leave it at that. Any other business that we need to discuss?
No, the only thing I would like to add, and I know, Dan, we've said this to you previously, but if you had not done all this heavy lifting, we would not be where we are today. So thank you very much.
I totally agree.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I third, fifth that.
Thank you. And I have served as member and chair of committees of various kinds for more than 40 years. And this, you guys clearly rank in the very, very top of that kind of duty. And I thank you for all of your hard work and attendance and the dedication to the work that was done. And I fervently hope that the board adopts our recommendations. So thank you.
In our lifetime,
In our lifetime.
right?
Mine.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
There's a second.
I second.
All in favor, say aye.
I,
Any opposed? Thank you all very, very much, and have a happy and healthy holiday season to you. And hopefully you'll hear from me next week.
all right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
You too.